The crowd at the Three Spurs Rodeo in Sagebrush County was already whooping and hollering even before the barrel racing began. Spectators were shoulder to shoulder on the grandstands, decked out in shiny cowboy boots and 10-gallon hats, sipping sweet tea under the blistering afternoon sun. If you squinted, you might spot a few folks fanning themselves with old brochures from last year's barrel race, each one still bearing the name of the previous year's champion, Magnolia Maggie Starr. Maggie herself was warming up in the corrals behind the arena, adjusting her stirrups and running a final brush through her horse's mane. The air was electric with a kind of desert sizzle, the distinct crackle that said this was going to be a race to remember, though nobody could have guessed just how memorable it would become. Maggie loved the rodeo scene more than just about anyone. She'd grown up with horses in her blood, or so she liked to say at family gatherings, which always elicited playful groans from her relatives. She was known for her unwavering love of them, be they tall, short, sleek, or scraggly. Barrel racing was her passion, weaving a horse around 3 barrels in a cloverleaf pattern at breakneck speed. Nothing gave her goosebumps like the feeling of sprinting so fast the wind whistled in her ears. She'd set her sights on winning the trophy again this year. But her favorite horse, a fiery sorrel named Dandelion, had grown tender in the hooves just days before the competition. Desperate for a ride, she took a chance on a friend's offer. "You can borrow Clyde," her friend Todd had said. "He's kind of a new addition to my stable, but he's big and strong. Think he might work for you?" When Todd led Clyde out of the trailer that morning, Maggie had to do a double take. Clyde was barrel-chested, all right, with strong limbs and a glossy coat the color of golden oats. His mane and tail were a bit scraggly, looking as though they'd been subjected to a style experiment gone wrong, but Maggie didn't mind a horse with a rough edge. He seemed to have a gentle eye and stood more calmly than your run-of-the-mill, high-spirited racehorse. "He's a sweetheart," Todd affirmed, patting Clyde's neck. Clyde let out a soft whinny that sounded almost like, well, a quack. Maggie brushed that thought aside. Maybe she was just more exhausted than she realized at 6 in the morning. The trouble started small, a tiny seed of peculiarity sprouting the moment Maggie tried to mount up. Instead of stepping forward in a dignified manner, Clyde leaned backward and wiggled his hindquarters in a bizarre, almost waddling fashion. She blinked, not fully sure she'd seen what she thought she did. But she had a job to do. Get in the ring and give it her all. They trotted around the practice pen. Everything looked normal for the first lap. Then, as Maggie asked him to speed up into a canter, Clyde lowered his neck, lifted each forelimb high, and swung from side to side, wobbling in a motion that strongly resembled the gait of a clumsy duck that caused a loud burst of laughter from some spectators leaning on the fence. Maggie's face went beet red. "Come on, boy," she whispered, giving Clyde a firm squeeze with her calves. "Let's see if you can do better than that." Clyde, however, found his new style thoroughly charming. To Maggie's dismay, he embraced the waddling approach with gusto. When she tried to get him into a gallop, he responded by splaying his back legs, tilting forward, and giving the most ridiculous wide-swinging waddle you ever saw. It was as if someone had cast a comedic spell, turning him into some farmyard hybrid, half horse, half duck. Standing at the fence, Todd looked mortified, as if he feared he'd never sell another horse in his life. The ranch hand snickered and pointed. Maggie half expected someone to start handing out breadcrumbs, just to see if Clyde would take a nibble. She managed to calm herself. A horse was still a horse. Maybe he just needed a swift command. She tried coaxing him. She tried giving him a firmer nudge. She even tried the time-tested technique of letting him watch another horse gallop around, hoping Clyde might feel compelled to imitate his equine brethren. Nope, not a chance. Time after time, Clyde's movements regressed to that ridiculous waddle, as though he'd studied the strutting steps of barnyard fowl for years. Worst of all, he never showed any sign of discomfort or pain. He simply seemed to enjoy waddling like it was his own personal expression. He even tossed in a few happy snorts as if to brag, "Hey, did you notice how good I am at this duck walk?" By now, the other racers had finished their warm-ups and the main event was about to start. Maggie's name came blasting through the PA system. "And next up, folks, last year's champion, Maggie Starr, The announcer's voice echoed through the dusty air, accompanied by a ripple of applause from the stands. Heart-pounding, Maggie guided Clyde to the chute. She'd never considered scratching, but the more she looked at Clyde, the more she worried. He was not at all in the mindset to gallop. The barrel pattern out in the arena looked menacing now, each barrel almost mocking her with its steadfast assurance that they wouldn't be seeing record times. But Maggie's pride and stubbornness, and her love for a challenge, kept her in the game. With a final pat on Clyde's neck, she nudged him forward, hoping for a miracle. As the signal sounded, Maggie pressed her boots into Clyde's flanks, praying he would at least attempt a canter. Weighing the situation, Clyde lowered his head, extended his legs, and performed one of the most theatrical duck walks to date. The audience gasped. One kid let out a squeal that sounded a lot like, "Mama, that horse is quacking." In a hopeless attempt to maintain some semblance of speed, Maggie leaned forward in the saddle, giving Clyde as much rein as possible. The horse flapped his lips, an other sound reminiscent of a duck's call, then proceeded in slow, lumbering arcs around each barrel. It wasn't a gallop. It was barely a trot. The commentators in the box were speechless. Across the arena, other riders were doubled over in laughter. A few brushed away tears as they watched a fully grown competitor trying to coax her mount into something vaguely resembling a sprint. Clyde, evidently in the performance of his life, waddled wide around each barrel left, swaying so drastically that it almost looked like a comedic dance routine. By the time Maggie brought him across the finish line, the timer put the run at nearly triple the average barrel racing time. Once the crowd realized what had happened, they erupted into cheers and laughter, not out of meanness but sheer delight at the absurdity of it all. While Maggie appreciated a good laugh, especially among rodeo folks known for their fair share of pranks and tall tales, her cheeks were on fire when she slid off Clyde's back. She avoided the assemblies of giggling onlookers by ducking, no pun intended, behind the stables, hoping to regroup backstage. She felt a mixture of embarrassment and pity for poor Clyde, who never asked for the scornful snorts of the other horses. Todd hurried after her, stammering apologies. "I had no idea, Mags. We never did that before. Maybe it's all these people and the noise and—" "Oh, hush, Todd," she muttered. "We'll figure something out. Every horse can learn if you don't give up on 'em." Of course, figuring something out turned into a series of comedic episodes. Maggie decided to give Clyde a second chance the following weekend at the Calico Creek Rodeo, thinking maybe a smaller event, with fewer spectators, would ease his nerves. Surely, away from the big crowds, Clyde wouldn't feel the urge to show off that ludicrous strut. It was a smaller rodeo indeed, but his entrance was no less theatrical. The minute Maggie steered him toward the warm-up arena, Clyde started arching his neck, lifting his knees high, bobbing across the dirt in that comedic waddle. The judges looked on, perplexed, while the crowd tittered. Some snapped pictures, capturing the silhouette of a determined rider on an ungainly duck-walking horse. Cowboy hopped off his own ride, unable to contain his mirth. He nearly doubled over with laughter, boots kicking up dust. Maggie was determined. If there was a horse in the entire Western Territory that needed her help, it was Clyde. She enlisted the support of an eccentric horse whisperer named Jody. Jody had the extraordinary ability to calm even the most anxious animals, pulling them out of stalls plastered with red dangerous warnings. She was rumored to help a horse discover its true path by meditating in the stable with them, chanting all sorts of mystical rhymes. Maggie figured that if anyone could coax a gallop out of Clyde, it was Jody. "He's definitely tuned into a different radio frequency," Jody said after her first session, emerging with a curious glow in her eyes. "I've never seen it in a horse before, but Clyde's soul identifies more with ducks than horses." Maggie blinked in disbelief, but Jody nodded solemnly. "He doesn't feel pain or stress, but something inside him insists that waddling is the proper way to move." Though Maggie suspected some level of theatrics in Jody's diagnosis, she also felt oddly relieved. Maybe Clyde wasn't flawed. Maybe this was just who he was. No matter how unusual, no matter how comical, it might not necessarily be a defect. That revelation spurred a new approach. If Clyde insisted on waddling, she'd teach him to do it around the barrels with precise efficiency. If the horse couldn't gallop, maybe they'd give the audience a show they'd never forget, and do it with style. The practice sessions were something to behold. Out in Todd's ranch, Maggie set up 3 barrels in the open field. Instead of aiming for an explosive sprint, she encouraged Clyde to continue his waddling at a consistent, purposeful tempo. Left, right, a wide side-to-side motion that was improbably graceful for something so silly to behold. She timed each waddle with a gentle cue of the reins, teaching him to pivot around the barrel with small circles of motion. Clyde caught on quickly. Whenever she needed a burst of speed, she'd cluck and lightly tap his sides. He never broke into a real gallop, but he could muster a sort of rapid waddle. Sure, it was still slower than a typical trot, but it was a step up from the comedic snail's pace. Most surprisingly, Clyde seemed to relish the routine. He had approached the barrels with surprising deftness, as though saying, "You want a duck walk? I'll give you a great duck walk." Word started traveling. Tales of the duck-walking barrel racer horse spread through the ranching community faster than a tumbleweed in a desert storm. Folks from neighboring counties dropped by to witness the phenomenon. Some brought leftover corn cobs or stale dinner rolls, half-jokingly hoping Clyde would prove his duck identity by sampling them. Journalists from small-town papers came to snap pictures, drawn by the promise of a good human interest story. Even the local radio station broadcast a segment, "Mystery Horse Waddles Its Way into Rodeo Legend." Maggie initially balked at the spotlight, but Todd convinced her that any press was good press, especially if it drew a crowd to the upcoming Sagebrush Barrel Bonanza, one of the region's most anticipated events. When the day of the Sagebrush Barrel Bonanza arrived, the stands were more packed than ever. The hype around Clyde's peculiar style had clearly boosted ticket sales, and the atmosphere buzzed with curiosity. Riders and trainers from near and far gathered, each sporting polished saddles and braided manes on meticulously trained horses. The tension in the air among the serious competitors was thick as molasses. Nobody wanted to get beaten by a waddling oddity. Meanwhile, the stands filled up with families who had heard the rumor. The Duck Walk Derby, some people called it. Vendors sold rubber duck souvenirs and quacking toys, claiming they were official merchandise. Maggie rolled her eyes at the spectacle, feeling both mortified and amused that her predicament had become a novelty act. Once again, Maggie found herself at the start line. This time, however, she and Clyde had a plan. The announcer, no stranger to flamboyance, let his voice boom through the loudspeakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, hold on to your hats because we have a special performance. Here comes Maggie Starr on the unstoppable Clyde." A wave of photography flashes sparkled over the audience, capturing each moment. With a resolve she had never felt before, Maggie touched her heels to Clyde's sides. Sure enough, he sank into his comedic waddle. Left, right off they went, heading toward the first barrel with more control than ever. She steered him evenly around the barrel, making a neat, albeit slow, turn. A smattering of applause rippled through the bleachers. Few believed it was possible, but Clyde's practice sessions actually paid off. He navigated the clover leaf, though not with speed, but with an unexpected smoothness. He didn't knock any barrels over. He didn't get spooked. He kept his wide swinging steps consistent. By the second barrel, the crowd had warmed up to the idea, switching from giggles to genuine cheers. Even the announcer sounded impressed. "Well, folks, this unorthodox method seems to be working for them. That's a mighty fine turn there, and would you look at that? Clyde is hustling along with all the precious dignity of a duck on a mission." Maggie suppressed a grin, focusing on her cues, reinforcing each little pivot. Rounding the third barrel, Clyde managed a finishing spurt, a quickening of the waddle that kicked up a little dust. They crossed the timer line, heads high. The number displayed was far from the winning time. It was still about 5 or 6 seconds slower than the typical top barrel racer. But the crowd's enthusiasm was undeniable. They erupted into hoots, whistles, and stomps. The stands rattled with applause as Maggie patted Clyde's neck, and he responded by bobbing his head. Todd cheered loudest of all, nearly exhausting his voice. Horses in the holding area pranced nervously, as if unsettled by the waves of noise. Meanwhile, 1 or 2 serious racers sneered, but their expressions melted into grudging admiration when the stadium's cheers wouldn't let up. In the end, someone else rightfully took the championship. An astonishingly fast mare ridden by a talented cowgirl from Red Rock. Maggie knew her hat was off to them. She guided Clyde away from the barrels, not sure what to expect. To her utter surprise, a young reporter from a local station approached, microphone in hand. Maggie Starr, can we get a word?" She hesitated but then nodded, sliding down from the saddle. The reporter, looking elated, launched into his questions. "How did you train this horse to do that? Where did the idea come from? What's next for you two?" Maggie paused, gazing at Clyde, who responded with a soft whicker. "Well," she began, "I can't say I trained him to think he's a duck. That part came naturally. What I did was figure out how to work with him, not against him. Sometimes you have to recognize a horse's quirks. It doesn't mean we'll be the fastest, but we can still have a great time out there and put on a show." As if to second her statement, Clyde let out a deep snort that raised a few smiles from the gathering crowd. People pressed closer, some snapping pictures, others offering wide-eyed compliments. One father dressed in a plaid shirt leaned in with his kids. "That was amazing. My daughter was laughing so hard, but she was also cheering. We've never seen anything like you two." His little girl nodded, hugging a rubber duck she'd bought at a vendor's stall. There was a sense of genuine warmth in those interactions, a realization that horse riding wasn't all about trophies or lightning-fast times. Sure, the top riders mostly had the calm, disciplined classic gallopers most people envision, but no one was likely to forget the duck-walking horse. Before leaving, Maggie felt a small tug at her sleeve. A teenage girl in well-worn boots and braided pigtails asked shyly, What if my horse has a weird quirk like that? Do you think that's okay?" Maggie smiled. "It's more than okay," she replied, gentler than ever. "Find a way to embrace it, work with it. You never know, it might make you stand out in a wonderful way." In the weeks that followed, folks witnessed an odd phenomenon. People started bringing slightly unconventional horses to small local rodeos. One had a habit of pawing the ground excessively before each run. Another would only run if it heard country music playing. Suddenly, the idea of let the horse be itself took on a whole new life, all thanks to Clyde. Some swore that at social gatherings you could spot a smug Todd boasting, "Yeah, that's my horse," the one who started the duck walk trend. He may or may not have been cashing in on a side hustle, selling rubber duck merchandise with Clyde's silhouette printed on the front. Maggie continued to compete with Clyde whenever she could. They never topped the leaderboard. But they grew in popularity. Fans lined up just to see the spectacle, to find out if the legendary duck walker was truly as bizarre as they'd heard. Each time, Maggie took the opportunity to show them, yes, it was bizarre, and yes, it was absolutely magnificent. There was an undiluted joy in Clyde's performance. He wasn't constrained by what a horse should do. He pranced in the only way that reflected his unique sense of self. To Maggie, the question was no longer, how do I stop him from duck walking, but rather, how can we make the best barrel racing duck walk you've ever seen? Of course, there were still the occasional naysayers, competitors, who grumbled that Maggie was turning the sport into a circus act, or that the thunderous applause for Clyde was overshadowing serious riders who'd spent years perfecting technique. Yet for every one cynic, there were 10 spectators who talked about the new sense of inclusivity in the rodeo. The commentary shifted. Who said a horse had to run a certain way to be considered worthy of the arena? It became a rallying cry of sorts. Let the horse's character shine through. One sunny afternoon, about a year after Clyde's first infamous waddle, Maggie led him back into the Three Spurs rodeo grounds. This time, the place was thrumming with eager fans, looking for fresh amusement. Many wore t-shirts with a cartoonish horse-duck hybrid, while children carried plastic wands shaped like waddling stirrups. As Maggie walked around, she overheard numerous voices. "Do you think Clyde will do his trademark duck pivot? Is it true he can waddle faster than some horses can trot? I heard he's got a new move that looks like a flamingo stance." Maggie merely smiled. She spotted Todd giving the press a rundown, gesturing wildly, explaining Clyde's supposed daily routine of swimming in the pond. He didn't, but Todd needed to keep the legend alive. When they entered the arena to compete, Maggie felt a wave of fond nostalgia. She remembered the embarrassment, the flushed cheeks, and the snide laughter. Now, the laughter was replaced by roars of encouragement, and Maggie wouldn't have traded that for any blue ribbon. They took their position at the starting line. She gave Clyde a reassuring pat, and she could swear he puffed himself up with pride. The buzzer sounded, off they went, weaving that waddle around the barrels with an ease that came only through trust, practice, and acceptance. They weren't the fastest, but they were the most memorable. And for Maggie, someone who used to measure success solely by clock time, this was a victory in its own right. The crowd stood as they finished, an ovation that sent cheers rolling over the stands like thunder. In that raucous celebration, she realized that maybe, just maybe, Clyde was teaching her something important. Galloping through life at top speed isn't everything. Sometimes making people laugh and forging a connection is far more rewarding. Afterwards, a handful of children rushed the fence, calling out, "Can we pet Clyde? Is it true he can quack?" Maggie led him over, letting them gently pat his sturdy neck. He blew soft breaths on their little hands, eliciting squeals of delight. One small boy planted a rubber duck on the fence rail as a gift for Clyde. It was a little toy wearing a tiny cowboy hat. In response, Clyde tilted his head, sniffed it, and stood almost reverently, as if acknowledging a kindred spirit. Maggie couldn't help but laugh, wiping away a tiny tear conjured by the sweetness of the moment. On the way back to the stable, Todd caught up. He clapped Maggie on the back with a grin, stretching ear to ear. "I think we're onto something big," he said. "There's talk of inviting you two on a rodeo circuit across the state. People can't get enough of this story." Maggie shrugged. "If it helps folks see that no horse is worthless or broken, that's enough for me. I don't need a bigger stage, though," she added mischievously, "I won't say no to a little adventure if it means we can keep spreading the message." The sun began to set, painting the sky in peach and orange hues. Maggie watched the horizon, leaning against Clyde, who was nibbling at a patch of grass. She thought about all the times she'd chased that perfect barrel racing performance, all those early mornings spent drilling techniques, the heartbreak of seeing Dandelion injured, and the mortification of Clyde's debut. None of that mattered now. They had found their groove, a special connection no one else quite understood. Rubbing Clyde's shoulder, she whispered, "Thank you, boy. You taught me to see things differently. Maybe we're not the fastest, but we sure make a splash." Clyde rumbled in his chest, a soft nicker that could almost be mistaken for laughter. Maggie liked to imagine that if Clyde could talk, he'd say, "Don't worry, my waddle is unstoppable." They lingered in the peaceful twilight, a bizarre and beautiful duo. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sounds of the rodeo drifted through the air. An announcer's echo, the clanging of gates, the cheering of fans, and the rhythmic pounding of hooves. But amid all that noise, Maggie and Clyde stood quietly, content in their bond. A champion of acceptance and a horse that refused to be anything other than himself.